Good evening and welcome to the Orwell Lecture 2022. My name is Ken MacDonald. I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Orwell Foundation, and we're particularly delighted that our lecturer for 2022 is going to be Lisa Nandy. And thank you very much for doing this, Lisa. I'll be plugging Lisa's book a little later on. Lisa was born in Manchester and studied politics at the University of Newcastle and then public policy at Birkbeck College in the University of London. Very appropriately for an Orwell lecturer, she was elected MP, Labour MP for Wigan in 2010. And in the years since her election, as well as holding a number of shadow cabinet posts, she's also become well known around the country as one of the more original thinkers in the modern Labour Party. And in 2020, she stood for the Labour Party leadership. And many outside observers felt that she ran a strikingly open and thoughtful campaign during that contest, and it attracted a great deal of interest around the country. When Keir Starmer became leader, he appointed her Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, and in a reshuffle the following year, he appointed her Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and that's the post that she still holds and discharges with great distinction, full of ideas in that role. Very recently, Lisa published a book, All In, How We Build a Country That Works, which was described by Jess Phillips as brilliant, brave, and bursting with ideas, and by John Cruddas as a positive agenda for change and renewal rooted in the best traditions of the Labour movement. We're really delighted to have Lisa with us tonight. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we all look forward immensely to hearing what you have to say.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ken, for that introduction, even if you did mention the Labour leadership contest, never to be mentioned again. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Particularly lovely to see Richard here tonight. You've done so much for us in Wigan over the years, in the true tradition of George Orwell, and it's lovely to see you here again tonight. At a time when we appear to have lost sight of who we are and our place in the world, when we seem to have lost even any sense that real change is fundamentally possible, I want to talk to you about the country that lies beneath the surface and why it's time for that country to take charge of its own destiny. We're heading into the hardest winter with hope, trust and inspiration in short supply. It might be tempting in the face of that challenge to retreat and play it safe, simply to defend what is left after a dark, divisive decade of decay. But there are moments in history when the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and a sea change is upon us. And this is one of those times. In 1937, my town in Wigan, a town that stood at the centre of the world, powering our country through dangerous, difficult work in the coal mines, came to symbolise the case for change when George Orwell documented the grinding poverty and squalor that so many working class families endured. And a few years later, the working class men that Orwell had come to so admire returned home from the devastation of war, unwilling to accept those conditions any longer. And the Attlee government responded by building more council houses than any other government to date in British history, and bringing common goods into common ownership for the common good. Then nearly a century later, we found ourselves at the centre of that political debate once again, in a proud industrial town that had been buffeted by waves of globalisation. The smoke signals started to appear, falling voter turnout, a dramatic rise in support for UKIP, in a town that had driven out right-wing activists and openly racist parties over and over again for a century, and then the vote to leave the European Union. The alarm bells had been sounding by this point for a decade, but the political system just couldn't or perhaps wouldn't respond. In the 14 years since the global economic crisis, we've taken all the wrong cues from those uprisings, unable or unwilling to hear that roar, as George Eliot put it, that lies on the other side of silence. And perhaps this is why, as the storm clouds have gathered, nothing new has emerged in place of a discredited, broken economic system. Because Britain opened up to globalisation in 1997 in order to lead the world, not to leave it. And it gave us an open economy and influence in the world. And there were many winners too. The decision by the last Labour government to invest in education equipped so many young people with the skills and the resilience to adapt, to retrain, to grab hold of opportunities and to make their home in places that in turn reap the benefits of this open global Britain. But while those with knowledge and skills and assets thrived, others were left to count the cost. The places that were, as Tony Blair put it, swift to adapt, slow to complain, open, willing and able to change, pulled further and further ahead, while others were left to pull further and further behind. And as good jobs moved elsewhere, from our industrial and coastal towns, the base of the local economy crumbled. Young people who could grabbed hold of the opportunities that were opened up to them by the last Labour government, often for the first time in their family history, and went off to university and to find better paid work elsewhere. But with their loss and the loss of those good jobs went the spending power that sustained the bus networks and the thriving high streets and the post offices and the pubs and the close-knit families that make up a social fabric of a place. And this is how a political consensus began that lasted for decades, built on an economic model that drove investment into sectors and places that were already thriving in the belief that the benefits would trickle down and trickle out. The people who powered the world became recipients of growth, not contributors. No longer deemed to have a contribution to make, they became the beneficiaries of redistribution. And when that redistribution ended under the Cameron government, it fueled a powerful sense of loss and alienation and a powerful political backlash. The effect of all of this has been whole swathes of our country have been written off and written out of our national story. So now yesterday, the Minister for Eastern Germany told me, we've taken two countries and turned them into one, while you in Britain have taken one country and turned it into two. And in every part of the UK, there are an army of people who are told that their contribution simply doesn't count. Orwell wrote about these different universes that people inhabited in those years ahead of the Second World War. He could have been writing yesterday. He writes of the miners who were laid off when there was no work, who went unpaid when machinery broke down, who were forced to pay out daily extortionate sums for lamp hire from their hard-won wages. And when the great campaigning journalist Roswyn Jones came to Wigan nearly a century later, she found that same story among the care workers of modern Britain on 0 hours contracts, denied payment for travel time and forced to buy their own PPE. But this time, instead of telling their story for them, through the Road to Wigan Pier project, she made sure that they could tell it themselves. Now, just as in 1945, we've had to confront the reality that a country that writes off its own people cannot rise to the moment. And a country that tries to move forwards by the few, for the few, will never, ever succeed. It takes a nation. And Britain is almost unique in trying to power a modern economy using only a handful of people in a handful of places in a few small parts of the country. And even the so-called winners are losing. We're forcing more and more people into our major cities to find work and decent wages. 20 years ago, I was one of them, moving from Lancashire to London to try and find better opportunities. But what did I find too? I found the soaring, crippling housing costs that are holding back a generation and extremes of inequality, of poverty and wealth living side by side and pressure on public services. It's left us with a housing crisis, a food crisis, an energy crisis, a mental health crisis, and it's created waves of political upheaval. The votes for Leave and the votes for Yes were people calling time on an economic model that had destroyed the things that mattered and a political system that had refused to respond. And that result in the EU referendum, 52-48, it left us with only a mandate for compromise. But our politics failed us again. In the angry debate that followed, for years, we found endless ways to divide ourselves from each other. But the tighter that we pulled, the tighter the knot was tied. And we learnt that a house divided cannot stand. So now, as we turn to face new challenges, an energy revolution that will leave none of us untouched, a rapidly ageing population that creates huge pressure on public services, even as we celebrate the fact that people can live longer and know their grandchildren. We can no longer continue to write off the assets and the talent and the potential that exists amongst all people in every part of Britain. Because by doing so, over the last decade, it has left us completely unable to respond to this moment. And that's why I've come here today to say that we need a great rebalancing of power in Britain, a great national mission that includes all of our people in every part of Britain and not just some. But to rebuild our country, politicians have to live in it, understand it and respect it. To lead this country, you have to like it. The experience of too many people in our country is still now to be routinely dismissed, patronised and insulted by the people who purport to lead them. Now, Orwell was no stranger to this. He's controversial in Wigan for his characterisation of our way of life. His landlady, Mrs. Brooker, in the first chapter of The Road to Wigan Pier, is described as slovenly, lazy, unscrupulous and dirty. Just as after the Leave vote, we were pilloried in towns like Wigan for being little Englanders, too stupid to understand the implications of the question we were asked, or too racist and xenophobic to care. None of this is who we are. We're a proud industrial town that within living memory powered the world. We're a town shaped by waves of immigration from Ireland and Scotland that has always looked out to the world and looked out for our people at home. Through the Second World War, the tough years of the miners' strike and a decade of austerity, we have been unswervingly patriotic, pragmatic and principled. My experience as a city-born MP in an industrial town, as a Remain campaigner in a community that voted by a factor of 2-1 to Leave, and as the youngest MP elected to represent a constituency that has aged as young people have moved to major cities. That experience has convinced me that we can transcend our divisions in Britain, but only if we respect, like, and seek to understand all of the British people and the contribution that they can make. And it's precisely because I've represented a town buffeted by globalisation, at the epicentre of those waves of political upheaval, that I've been able to understand just how badly change is needed. The last 12 years, proudest years as Wigan's Member of Parliament, has changed me and changed my political outlook. Allowed me to drive the debate that has followed and to shape that debate as well. And like me, Orwell was changed by the people he met in Wigan. As you read through The Road to Wigan Pier, you start to feel that here is a man who is going on a journey, being changed and shaped by the people he comes into contact with. He makes no secret of his admiration for miners. Their lamplit world down here, he says, is as necessary to the daylit world above as the root is to the flower. And he came to see, as I have, that the people who drive our buses, who deliver our mail, who work in our shops, who care for our families, these are the real wealth creators and the foundation of our economy and of our country. They were the people who sounded the alarm first on an economic model that is fundamentally broken and a political system that was incapable of responding. And they were right. And while rentier capitalism has been allowed to run riot, a quiet patriotism has been at work in every community in our country that spurs people on to build a country that works. It's curious to me that there are those on the left who dismiss and belittle this quiet patriotism, believing in years past that it was acceptable to wave the flags of so many countries except our own. And when I look at the battle raging now in a divided Tory party, right now, a bitter turf war that pits the so-called red wall against the so-called blue, it reminds me that there is no future for political parties that become so consumed by their own identity that they lose sight of the country in front of them. One cannot see the modern world as it is unless one recognises the overwhelming strength of patriotism, national loyalty, George Orwell writes. In certain circumstances, it can break down. At certain levels of civilization, it does not exist. But as a positive force, there is nothing to set beside it. That sense of being part of something bigger than you are, the belief that you have not just a right, but a duty to contribute to the common good, is Britain's greatest untapped asset. That by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more than we achieve alone. So when love of family, community and country spurs people on to build and create and invest for the long haul, whether it's NHS workers celebrated by Danny Boyle in that hymn to collective endeavour that was the 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony, or the young England footballers celebrated and championed by Gareth Southgate in his love letter to the people of England, or the ordinary, extraordinary people that I've met in every part of Britain over the last 12 years who are quietly rebuilding our communities and protecting and defending everything that matters. Whichever one of those it is, we should celebrate it and we should support them. In The Road to Wigan Pier, George Orwell recounts the story of a man he's just met, a miner, half-blinded in this most useful of professions. He's forced to brave the wind and cold daily to draw his pension. He has no ability, says Orwell, to demand the pension, which is his right. 1,000 influences press a working-class man into a passive role, he says. He does not act, he is acted upon. He feels himself the slave of a mysterious authority and has a firm conviction that they will never allow them to do this, that and the other. Almost a century later, on the day of the EU referendum itself, in the Wigan town centre, I heard those exact words from an elderly man. It doesn't matter what we vote for, he told me, because they'll never allow it. I argued with him that day, and 3 years later, as we went round in circles trying to overturn the result, I realised he was right. Through all of this runs a system that strips people of their agency and the contribution that they have to make. This is a paternalism that has run right through modern politics, summed up for me in 2019, when we had a choice between a Conservative leader promising to deliver on the priorities of the British people and a Labour leader promising to transform society on behalf of the British people. This is the gulf between the people and the political class that Orwell came to rail against. To lead this country, you have to believe in its people and the contribution that we have to make. We don't want to be passive recipients of economic growth. We want to contribute to and to share in the country's success. Contribution, not redistribution. This was Orwell's journey. It must be ours. That's why I believe that we must tilt the balance of power back to people so that the country that is only just beneath the surface can take charge of its own destiny. So we can harness that quiet patriotism, that great force out in the country and turn it towards the common good. My party, Labour, was forged out of the traditions of mutual self-help that led to the creation of cooperative societies, burial societies, and the trade unions. We've lost something of this in recent decades, and we must remember it again. So that we can smash up a century of centralisation, because rebuilding the national economy begins with the local. So we can hand power back to our communities to take decisions about their own families, their communities and their lives, and to councils and mayors through real powers over housing and transport and skills so that they can drive growth from the bottom up and build thriving, inclusive places where people want to live and work for all and not just for some. Too often these are the people who have to fight the system to achieve meaningful change, when they should feel the whole system pulling in behind them. Only by trusting communities, giving people the opportunity to contribute, will we be able to rise to this challenge of national renewal, restore trust in our political institutions, and rebuild bridges across our divided nation. None of the challenges we now face can be solved from the centre. It will take a nation, drawing on all of our assets, all of our talent. Every person and place must be able again to make a contribution to our national prosperity. This is the core of my political beliefs, forged over the last 12 years as the Member of Parliament for a town made famous the world over by George Orwell 100 years ago. And it is why in one of the most centralised countries in the world, in which the contribution of most people has been written off and written out of our national story, we have to push power outwards and put power back in the hands of the people who are already rebuilding the only way we can, together. There are, as Harry Pitts, the academic, says, those on left and right who luxuriate in the flames licking at the side of liberal democracy, because they know that a representative democracy that fails to give representation cannot survive. And only yesterday, as we gathered in Leeds to set out that the driving mission of the next Labour government will be to effect the biggest transfer of power, wealth and opportunity out of Westminster in British history, some journalists suggested that this is a world away from what people care about. They couldn't be more wrong, because I've learned that those with a stake in the outcome and skin in the game work harder, try longer, think more creatively and do more because they can do no other. And it is only by tilting the balance of power back in their favour that we'll once again build a country that works. Writing during the Blitz, with the fate of the country in the balance, Orwell said, "Nothing ever stands still. We must add to our heritage or lose it. We must grow greater or less. We must go forward or backward." In these stormy times, when so much is broken and nothing is certain, we must go forward. We will rise to this challenge and we will carry the torch forwards and we will rebuild Britain the only way we can, together. Thank you.
Well, Lisa, I thought that was a really wonderful and quite important statement of a series of principles and a brave statement of them. And I thought it was really wonderful. Thank you so much. We've got time for questions, and I'm sure there'll be some. And if you ask a question, we've got microphones which will be passed around to you. Could you please identify yourself before you ask your question? I just want to, before we start, I just want to ask you one myself, which I'll exert my privilege as chair of the lecture to ask you this. You sketched out a vision of a sort of left.
But can I just say, I've got a beer coming, so
okay.
No offence.
Excuse me, can I have one as well?
Everyone, this is my book editor, John, who is masquerading as our barman tonight.
You sketched I thought, quite a moving picture of what left patriotism might look like. And the picture you painted would have been very familiar to Orwell, and was probably quite close to his vision of what a left patriotism would look like. So what's your response to people, and in recent years there have been growing numbers of them who see the country's heritage as being a source of shame rather than pride? And often these are people who would naturally be of the left and supporters of the Labour Party. How do you deal with that criticism?
Well, I think perhaps because my dad is from India. He was born and brought up in Calcutta. He still calls it Calcutta, but has lived most of his life in England. And he says, like the great Eric Hobsbawm, who was a regular feature at Birkbeck, where I studied round the corner, he says, as an immigrant, you often see things at a slight tangent to the world. And I think perhaps because of that, I have a sort of simultaneous ability to see the strength and the light in our history and also the darkness in our past, and to feel completely comfortable with those things. I'm half Indian, I'm mixed race. My mum hails from the south. I was born and brought up in the north. I'm a Mancunian by birth and a Wiganer by choice. I feel completely comfortable with feeling at once English, British, and proudly part of the European Union for many, many years, and an internationalist as well in a party that has always had a strong international tradition. I think we have to get comfortable with messiness and complexity in British politics. I actually think the public are far more comfortable with it than we are. In those very angry years after the referendum, when the political system had pulled apart and polarised really sharply amongst people who'd been relatively reasonable during the EU referendum debates and then became sharply polarised afterwards. My next door neighbours voted Leave. They were still putting my bins out on a Wednesday when I was in Parliament. You know, there was families in every part of the country who'd found a pragmatism and an ability to compromise and an ability to see the world as it is. And that's what I found when I made my home in Wigan over a decade ago. I found people who have the ability to see the strength in our country's past and also the problems. And like Orwell said, you know, our past is a sort of living, breathing bridge to the future. It was never meant to be a fixed moment in our history. This is the invisible chain that binds the nation together. And to constantly be able to rethink and reassess and reappraise the history of Britain for good or bad in order to take us forwards, seems to me that's the loss of that on the left has been a real loss for us and a loss for the country. And I think slowly we're starting to remember that again.
Okay. It's a great shame you're not going to be the next Prime Minister. So I promise not to say that. Sorry, Liz. So we've got one here. Can I ask people, because they're going to be so many questions, can I ask people, not to make long statements, but to genuinely ask questions and to only ask one question and to keep them quite brief. So you first.
Okay, I'm Nicola Rossi. We met briefly in Wigan with the Orwell Society, dystopian author. My question is about your process. You gave such an articulate speech tonight, so many ideas. You talked about how it's kind of been formulated over the last 12 years. What's your process for pulling that together? When do you get time to think when you have so many other things to do?
It's a good question.
It's a lovely question. Well, I don't know. I mean, I wrote this book recently, and a very senior member of HarperCollins North, who is now masquerading as our barman, was a constant source of support for all of that. But I wrote most of it when I was either on the train or sitting at Crewe railway station in the middle of the night waiting for an Avanti train that never materialised. Half of it on my phone. And I do remember thinking at some point, I'm sure Churchill didn't have to put up with this. But I suppose really it's people. That's the thing that's changed me over the last 12 years, and that's where I've learned the most about our country. Whether it's in Sunderland, meeting these inspirational women who were watching their town centre fall apart and started to buy up the housing stock that existed there with a small grant from the last Labour government. They've managed to buy up large swathes of the housing stock in their village, turn it back into public use. They're letting it out to local people at affordable rents in good condition. They're holding families together and they're using the proceeds to reinvest in the people of Hendon in Sunderland. They call themselves back on the map in recognition of how much they used to contribute and how much they have to contribute still. These are the people that inspire me every day. And I think the biggest thing for me was during the referendum, I spent 6 months touring parts of the north of England where people had voted Labour consistently for 100 years and where we found ourselves on the other side of the argument to them. And after about 6 months, it was on a visit to the Nissan factory in Sunderland that I suddenly stopped talking and started listening. I think listening is a slightly lost art in British politics. But listening, processing, reading, exploring the world beyond your borders, particularly reading fiction for me, is a good way of remembering that there is a wider world than the bubble that we inhabit in Westminster. And it's that really that has taught me everything that I've learned and had the privilege to learn over the last 12 years.
Oh, I'd forgotten that we've got...
no. Look,
terribly sorry.
You've written off the next generation.
We've got two of our Orwell Youth Fellows here, and I'm supposed to ask them first. I'm really sorry about that. So the Youth Fellows are young people who were finalists for the Orwell Youth Prize, and we're delighted to have you here. So you must be Bella.
Right.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. I was wondering if you think it's sort of possible to have geographical equality kind of across the UK, or whether or not there'll always be more prosperous areas. And if you think it is possible, what are some of the kind of first steps that we should be taking towards that?
So my point is not that all areas have to be the same, have to reach the same level. It's that all parts of our country need to be allowed to take control of their own destiny. I stole this phrase from George Orwell, the country that lies beneath the surface. It's slight abridgment because he talked about the England, but must take charge of its own destiny. And I think there are moments in history when change doesn't just become possible, it becomes inevitable. And I think this is one of these moments, because there's a clamour for change everywhere you go in the country. And there's a recognition, I think, that things are fundamentally broken and that we can't go on like this. So I don't want to see everywhere become the same. I don't think that everywhere has to make the same choices. It may be that some parts of the country want to put more investment into high-tech jobs and skills, and others want to see specialisation in things like food production, which Wigan is now uniquely well placed to do and is really well known for. One of the things that people back home place a huge emphasis on is community life and the quality of life and green open spaces and the quality of our air and families being able to stay together and contribute. But I think all parts of the country have to have the right to take charge of their own destiny. And once you put that together, what you get is a country that works, where everyone has a place and everyone has a role and everyone has a stake in the outcome and skin in the game. That's when you get a country that works.
So that was Bella. Bella, could you tell us what you were shortlisted for?
I wrote a poem called Two for Joy, which is about the climate crisis and the approach we kind of take to our natural world.
Okay, thank you. And Hugh Ludford. Hugh.
Hi. Do you ever feel a conflict between your role as an MP and your role in the shadow government? Do you feel you have to pick between your loyalty to your constituents and your loyalty to your party?
So I felt this most of all actually during Brexit. I remember going to see Keir Starmer when I was on the backbenches before the 2019 election, when the Labour Party had decided to back a second referendum. And as always with Keir, from the first time I ever met him when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, succeeded Ken, and I went to see him about trafficked children who were being picked up and prosecuted as the criminals rather than the victims of crime. And all those years later, when I walked into his office during those very fractured, difficult years for Labour, I found him to be open and willing to listen, to change, and to be constructive and supportive. But one of the things I said to him and I said to Jeremy at the time was that what you're essentially forcing us to do is to either stand up for the interests of our constituents and the people that we represent, that we were founded to represent, or stand up for the Labour Party. And the Labour Party should never be in that place. Because, there'll be lots of people in this room who, like me, campaign for Remain and feel very passionately about Labour as an internationalist party, about Britain as an internationalist country, and about the role of our relationship with the European Union. But I think we got ourselves into a position during those years where we either did some economic harm or we did some democratic harm after the referendum. And that was a terrible choice that we should never have been forced to make. It was one of the reasons I never voted to have a referendum in the first place. But we got ourselves into that place, and I genuinely felt we were setting fire to democracy. When that man in Wigan Town Centre said to me, "They'll never allow it to happen," I thought he was talking nonsense, and he was right. And, after that, people being told that they were the wrong people who'd voted, even the name of the people's vote was felt as profoundly offensive back home, that they hadn't understood the question, as I said in the speech, that they were racist, that they were xenophobic, that they were little Englanders in a town that prides itself on having powered the world and still counts as its biggest employer, the Heinz food factory that exports products all over the world. We're not any of that. And I think there is a tension sometimes in British politics, but I think when you get yourself into a place where you have to set yourself either for your party or for people in the country, you're in a very bad place. And we've been incredibly polarised in the last few years in Britain. We've been incredibly divided, not just about Brexit, but about all sorts of things. But isn't that the job of any politician worth their salt, is to help the country negotiate its way through shared challenges and find a solution in the interests of the many? And that's what I think Labour is becoming again. And that's what I believe has to be at the core of the next Labour government and our approach to how we govern this country.
And Hugh, what were you shortlisted for?
A short story.
Short story, okay. Right, more questions. So there's a just in the stripy top just there. Again, if you could identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Megan Kenyon. Yesterday, Gordon Brown said during your a New Britain review that Labour wants to end the standoff between local and national politics, and you kind of talked about the fact that Britain is a really centralised country, and I wondered how you thought we could do that. Is it through more devolution? Is it by kind of regenerating the status of councillors to make them just as kind of well respected as MPs, like as a position? I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
So I think there are three things that we need to do. The first is to move far more power out of Westminster and Whitehall into the hands of local elected leaders in all parts of Britain. I don't care whether you want a mayor or you want your council to work with other like-minded councils in order to deliver the change that you need. Unlike this government, I don't think we should be prescriptive about that. I think we should respect the fact that in any democracy worth its salt, people have the right to consent to their own governance arrangements, and that we should hand power back to communities over housing, over skills, over transport, not just buses, but rail, over job centres, so that we can lever in investment to places that haven't seen it for 4 decades, and that we can start to build those good jobs that form the basis of a thriving local economy. No more of these small handouts from Westminster and Whitehall, small sums of our money repatriated back to us to deliver on the priorities of a group of junior ministers who've never set foot in the places that we call home. There's a paternalism that runs through that approach that I roundly rejected here. I don't think we know better than those communities and those local leaders. And I think we have to put power back into people's hands in order to build that country that can do well again. Secondly, I think we have to put power into the hands of communities in order to hold those people to account. Throughout the devolution reforms of the last decade, democracy has been an afterthought and the people have been cut out of the conversation. And some of the most inspiring work that I've seen has been by communities who've taken control of their own assets, whether it's live music venues or football clubs or housing stock or land, and use that to rebuild municipal socialism, to turn investment back into an asset for their community and to protect things of value. And we're absolutely determined to do that as the next Labour government, a community wealth fund, a powerful new community right to buy. And there's a man called Mark Gregory who's going to hate me for this, but I've just spotted him sitting over there, who is the chief economist for Ernst & Young, who's running a commission for us with communities across the country to work out how we can put more power, not just into the hands of local leaders, but into the community and the people's hands itself. But thirdly and finally, this is not an argument from me that the local is good and the national is bad. If anything, my experiences over the last 12 years as Wigan's MP have taught me that when national systems fail, the consequences locally are appalling. And what we need is national governments who are prepared to work together in order to defend democracy, to put people before profit, to take action on issues like climate change that are ruining lives across whole swathes of our country because of frequent flooding, that is putting homes and jobs and livelihoods at risk, and all of those global issues, through our trade deals and the way that they've eroded people's security and the foundations of a decent life. We need the central government to start doing its actual job and stop trying to do ours.
Okay, let's have one over here, the front row. Wait for the microphone. And could you tell us who you are before you ask a question? Thank you.
Troy Francis Brown. I was invited via the Orwell Youth Foundation. I just wanted to know, as an aspiring writer and politician, how can writers of today help you lot out with your great ideas like left-wing patriotism in the same way Orwell helps out Attlee in pushing forward politicians, because writers, politicians, they go together?
So I think this is a great question, actually, because it's the swirl of ideas and the currents of those ideas that you see over the course of history advancing the human cause. And I guess if I've learned anything over the last 12 years, I'm someone I was born in 79, the year that Margaret Thatcher came to power. I was 17 and a half before I saw my first Labour government. And over those years after 1997, I think I started to believe somehow that the arc of history always bends towards progress. And if I've learned anything in the last 12 years, it's that progress is not inevitable. It falls to every generation to pick up the baton and fight those battles anew. I talked to my dad about this a few years ago, who was involved in writing the Race Relations Act all those years ago. And his generation feels profoundly pessimistic about what they achieved. And I said to him, how do you win it? And he said, you don't. It's like people, every generation, it's like being in a boat. Some people are rowing that side, other people are rowing the other way. And he said, you've got to get in the boat and row as hard as you can and hope to God there are more of them than you. But I thought it was a really good wake-up call, actually, for my generation, who I think really dropped the ball on some of this. And it's made me more determined than ever that we've got to be more porous in politics. We've got to be able to hear those ideas that swirl around us. It's why I read a lot of fiction, because you often find these ideas expressed better through plays and through fiction first than you do elsewhere. And in the years after the global financial crash, when felt to me like we were living through one of those periods, a bit like the sort of 60s and 70s, where we were going through a period of profound social change. I remember saying to Billy Bragg, the musician, why is the arts world not responding to this? Because it's often through arts and culture that the mood music that shapes politics plays out. And he said it is there, but it's grime. That's where it's happening. It's happening through grime artists because they don't have the same outlets as other people. And I don't know much about grime. I'm not particularly cool, but there was I'm a Britney person myself. But there was I went and listened to some of this stuff, and he was absolutely right. There was a really powerful social critique of what had happened and what needed to happen next. To directly answer your question, I think just connect with people. Don't treat the worlds as different or separate. Those worlds have to collide in order for change to come.
Okay, there's a guy here in a cream sweater. Had his hand up for a long time.
Hi there, Harry Scoffin. Labour's obviously repositioned themselves as a party of home ownership. And obviously you mentioned in your speech a rentier capitalism has been allowed to run riot. I'm 27, I live in a flat with my mum. The service charges have gone up £10,000 in 5 years. That's the ultimate rent seeking. The guy lives in Monaco. Is Labour going to finish what Frank Dobson and, I've forgotten his name now, Nick Rainsford said, an end to feudalism? Because Orwell, he would be ashamed that leasehold, we're the only countries left in the world that have it. We're the lowest density cities in Europe as well. That's a big issue of productivity. Is Labour going to finish the unfinished work, to bring us mass shifts to commonhold and bring us into line with the rest of the world, and even Scotland, where they have tenement flats? We can all live, where we work. I think that's what we saw with the pandemic and, the move to home working. Has Labour got policies on this? Because obviously landlords, everyone goes on about private rented sector. I might be spending 40, 50% of my income on rent, but I don't want to be spending 40, 50, 60% of my income on service charges.
Yeah. So, to answer your question directly, yes, we have a view on this, and yes, we're going to end it. It's a feudal system that has no place in modern Britain, and we are going to end leasehold on new properties when we get into government in the first term of a Labour government, and we're going to phase out leasehold for those where it currently exists in favour of a new form of common hold. We've taken our inspiration from other countries around the world who've done this, countries like Australia, Canada and others who've pioneered new forms of ownership, because in the end, we fundamentally believe that a house is a home, and a decent home is not a market, it's a fundamental human right. So yes.
Okay. This guy in the grey sweater in front. Ken, could you tell us who you are?
My name's Ken, so I'm another Ken, and I'm a Lancastrian, originally. And I'm one of those who voted for Lisa originally, so there you go, just as a matter of interest.
There are a few of you knocking around, not many.
He's doing all right. But do you know, I've just managed to read the preface of your book, and it kind of relates to what the last speaker says. And what you talk about initially is the Attlee government. And I think we're in that moment again, are we not? And that, together with a more radical idea of the localism, surely what would really give that localism power is the renationalisation of water and energy. And some of us can just about remember when local authorities used to have a play in water and so on. Certainly wasn't, I don't remember the kind of pollution that went on and the profits that went on. Well, there wasn't any profits because they were nationalised industries. So, and I hope, Ken, as a fellow Ken, you'll allow me a slightly different one, because we also have shared heritage, Lisa and I. And of course, so does George Orwell, in that sense of where he was born. And I think India is one of the most, it's clearly a very, very important country, but I wonder what George Orwell would have made of that, what's happened there at the present time, and indeed what your dad and yourself think about that, because we need a relationship with them, but goodness me, it's a scary country at the moment.
So that's two good questions.
Yeah, so it's like harder than A-level maths. That didn't end particularly well for me either. Okay, firstly on common ownership, we've got a commitment to bring the railways back into public hands through nationalisation. Anyone who spent time on a train recently, well, if you got on a train, then well done you. If you've managed to get to where you were hoping to go to, then even better, and you deserve a prize. But it's never made any sense to me about that you could have competition on the railways, and there's only one track, there's only one set of trains, and these contracts are given out for so long in advance. But what we haven't done is said that we're going to give huge amounts of money to shareholders in those private companies. We'll take those contracts back into common ownership as they expire, because I don't fundamentally believe that at a time when there's very little money around and people haven't got a lot of it, that we should be using it on boosting the profits of private companies who've underperformed and underdelivered and treated their passengers and their workforce with complete and utter contempt. And in relation to other areas of common ownership, I talked about this amazing moment with the Attlee government where we brought all these public services into common hands for the common good. There are two areas that I know quite well around that. One is energy, where I think there is something quite radical and quite exciting we could do with energy, which is to put energy generation into the hands of communities and councils across this country. Already up and down the country, Labour councils are doing this. In Dagenham, Darren Rodwell, who's our leader there, has built hydro turbines in the Thames in order to generate electricity, which he's using to power local schools and help cut their energy bills, and so that they can spend more money on education and the learning of the children in front of them. And in other parts of the country too, whether it's Nick Forbes in the northeast or Richard Leese previously in Manchester, they've been building their own energy generation, and through the process building not just action against climate change, but also rebuilding their own communities to boot. But there's something more exciting, I think, on offer as well. I saw it in Plymouth recently, the community energy company that exists there, that is backed by the council and underwritten by the Labour Council, but is co-owned in common by hundreds and hundreds of local people. They've created local jobs, they've created local apprenticeships, they've broken up the power of the big energy generators over the energy market. And if there's one lesson from the last Labour government, I think, 13 years of Labour government, it's that the Sure Start that is conceived and funded from and executed from Whitehall doesn't survive a change of government, but the community energy company that is co-owned by hundreds and hundreds of local people does. And I think we need to bring people far more into the conversation. And the last thing I would say is that we're exploring at the moment how we can do that through housing, because I think bringing our housing stock back into public ownership is an absolutely pressing imperative for this country.
Okay, I think we've only got time for... Will you take two more?
Yeah, of course.
Two more questions.
Great.
So, yeah. Yeah, we'll just wait for the mic, it's just coming.
Or just shouts really loud.
Claire Spencer from Birmingham. really interested in what you were saying about how uncomfortable our institutions are with messy and how comfortable our communities are. And in all of the great ambition in A New Britain and in your book, I just wondered if you'd reflect on how you would protect and nurture the space for the messy in some of these very unmessy institutions.
Yeah, it's really, really good that, over the last 12 years, the more and more that, we tug on the knot and the knot has tightened, the more it's sort of occurred to me that our political institutions are just completely unfit for purpose. In Parliament, there aren't even spaces where you can come together and negotiate your way through shared challenges. The committee rooms, we sit opposite each other in an adversarial style, just as we do in the House of Commons chamber. The big sort of political moments of theatre, like Prime Minister's questions, are set up so that there has to be a clash rather than a compromise. And one of the things that me and a group of friends in Parliament, Caroline Lucas, Jo Swinson, Caroline Lucas, Jo Swinson, Stella Creasy and I called for during the Brexit debates was for a citizens' assembly to try and break the deadlock. Stella said it was like a circuit breaker. But the reason that the reason that she and I did that is because she and I were in the same political party with the same fundamental assessment of what was in the interests of Britain, being pulled in completely different directions, both of us going home night after night to be told by the people of Walthamstow that a second referendum was a no-brainer, and by the people of Wigan that we'd completely lost our minds. And I remember my friend Gloria Di Piero, who was the MP for Ashfield, just decided she'd had enough of people who lived a few streets away from each other telling her that she was completely out of touch with the public mood. And she got them all to come into a constituency office and to sit down and to try and thrash it out. And within about 20 minutes, they'd worked out that the only mandate was for compromise and that we were leaving the EU, but with a very close relationship with our European friends and neighbours. And these were people that had been emailing her for years, sort of, this is disgraceful, you're a terrible politician. Suddenly said, oh, no, that's fine, love, don't worry about it. And, moving on. I think the British people are really pragmatic, but we don't create spaces for people to come together. So one of the things in the Gordon Brown report that I think is particularly exciting is about the citizens' assemblies, the citizens' juries, trying to have much more deliberative democracy, participatory budgeting, so that people can be involved in their own priorities. And in my constituency of Wigan in 2008, we tried this. We knew that there were going to be huge deep cuts to public services. We knew that salami slicing wouldn't do. And so we threw over the power to the community. In the great Orwell tradition, we respected the contribution that they had to make, and we threw over the power to the community. And we said, you tell us what you want to defend and protect and preserve, and we will be driven by your priorities. But in return, we need your help. So we kept every library open. And now if you come to Wigan, you will walk into Beech Hill Library and you will find volunteers from a local charity and volunteers from the local community running that library. It's busier now than it was before, because we put people in the driving seat of the decisions again. I think we need to really think through, and Mark Steers, who's sitting over there from the UCL Policy Lab, this is one of the things that UCL is now at the forefront of, is rethinking our political institutions so that they're fit for these stormy times.
Okay. Back down here. You take one more.
Yeah.
So we'll just take one more after this. I'll go. You've had your hand up from the start, so we'll go to you. But here first, please.
Hi, Asma Benenda from the UCL Center for Education Policy. So my question is, we have research showing that in terms of social mobility, education is the main driver of social mobility, especially for women. So I was thinking, what are the plans, what are Labour's plans to put education policy at the forefront of Living Lab?
Thank you. I mean, one of my critiques of what's happened in the last few years, as this phrase levelling up has become part of our political lexicon, is that it's become a question of just moving jobs from one part of the country to the other. Yeah. And Keir and I were in Darlington not very long ago, and there've been a few Treasury jobs moved from London to Darlington. And one of the young people said to us, you might as well try and go to the moon as to get one of those jobs. By taking people out of the equation, I think this government has done real damage to their own levelling up agenda. Just as Labour, I think, in recent years has been far too place blind. We've been blind to the fact that for too many people, geography is destiny and you have to rebuild places if you want to give people opportunities. I think they've been very blind to the fact that people matter and that it's not just about places, it's about the people in them as well. So we asked David Blunkett to do us a report looking at skills and how we could better equip young people with the skills and the resilience that they need to navigate some of the sort of changing economy as Britain tries to find its place in the world and to rediscover who we are after Brexit. I think we have been going through somewhat of an identity crisis. And as we start to forge a future and think through what sort of economy we're going to build, who it works for, and what role we want to play in the world, the skills of our people are going to become more and more important. And that report by David Blunkett, which we've accepted in full, is about devolving the power over skills and FE training and investment in young people and far more flexibility over how you use the apprenticeship levy so that our young people get the chance to get those jobs, to contribute to the future of their communities. You know, I was born in Manchester, I grew up in Bury in Lancashire, and then made my home in Wigan. And I was one of those young people who chose to get out, to get on. I wanted to move first to Newcastle and then to London. I wanted to experience new places. But that was my choice, and I had a choice. For too many young people, there is no choice. And we're forcing them to choose between love and home and family and the future, work and opportunity. We should never be in a position again where we're imposing those choices on a generation of young people across our country. And if they want to stay and contribute, we're determined that they're going to get the backing from the next Labour government to do so.
Okay, final question. This guy with the green top on.
He's trying to work out if that's green or not, so was I.
Maybe I'm colourblind.
It looks green to me.
Maybe you're colourblind, Ken.
Either way. Hi, my name's Elliot. I'm an economics student here at UCL doing my master's degree. You've talked a lot about devolution, political institutions. I've no doubt they're part of the answer. What about economic power? How do you give power to people to bargain directly with their employers? You know, we've got a lot of, trade union activism at the moment, which is obviously, weighing a lot of people's minds as an important policy debate. But long term, how do we devolve economic power to Westminster?
So this is the key question, because without power, it's all talk, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So, do you know, a few years ago when Wigan Athletic went into administration, really good football club, well run, we think it was a consequence. A new owner took it over and within a few hours plunged us into administration. It's the second chapter in the book. But we were given the right to take over our football club in Wigan. There's a community right to buy. But only if we could find £16 million in a town where average earnings lag well behind the national average. You know, rights are no use if you don't have the means to enforce them. And it's one of the reasons that we've asked Mark to do this work for us on the Community Wealth Fund to make sure that people don't have the rights, but they have the means
Everyone
as well.
has the right to dine at Savoy.
Right, yeah. Although, would you? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a pint in a local pub. So this is the key question for us. There are some recommendations in the report that we launched yesterday about how you devolve economic power to local communities, because if we win the trust of people to govern again in a couple of years' time, we're going to inherit the worst economic situation since George Orwell wrote The Road to Wigan Pier. And every penny that we spend is going to have to be spent well, which means we can't afford for people who are hundreds of miles away from our communities, who don't see the assets and the potential in them to be making those spending decisions. They've got to be able to drive those spending decisions themselves. But there's also the point that I think you were getting at too, which is about money going into people's pockets. One of the reasons why towns like Wigan have fared so badly over the last decade is that process of relative decline has accelerated because of austerity. And when you take money from our nurses and our postal workers and our firefighters, you don't just take money from them and their families, you take it from the whole of Wigan, because every pound that goes back into the pockets of working people goes back out onto our shops and high streets and helps us to thrive. And when George Osborne front-loaded those harsh, deep cuts, what it did was to turbocharge that cycle of decline and we've got to work out how we're going to restore it. Now, there are a few ways that I know already that we can. We've got to give people the right to organise and to stand in solidarity with one another in order to exert collective power. And Angela Rayner has launched something called the New Deal for Working People, which repeals some of the anti-trade union laws and gives much more power to workers. And we think that there's more that we can do on that, and we're working with the trade union movement to make that a reality before the next election. And I'll just finally say this, is that there's a bit in the book where I talk about the summer of 2018, when I spent the entire summer on the picket line. And I didn't do that because I love a picket line and that's what I live for. You know, my job is to try and solve problems. And I'm one of the few people in this country who gets to go to Parliament and have a megaphone through which I can shout on behalf of people who often are completely invisible to decision makers and aren't heard. But during that summer, the reason that we were there was because our local hospital trust, who are fundamentally good people, but had been told by the Tory government that they had to make harsh deep cuts or they would get fined for doing so, and found themselves in a real bind, had found a way that they thought could save them lots of money by outsourcing our cleaners and our porters and our administrators at the hospital to an arm's length private company that would save them money on VAT. And those workers said to us, the NHS is more than a job for us, it's a vocation. We put on that uniform and we're proud to be there. We've seen what the race to the bottom means in terms of outsourcing. So often in this town, we've been round this track before. We don't want to go there. But more than that, this idea of an NHS that belongs to us all and that we all contribute to, that is an idea worth fighting for. So we fought it hard. And we won that battle in the end. We won it because of an enlightened Labour Council who saw the damage that it was doing and stepped forward with some funding to help plug the gap and avoid the fine. But we also then went to the workforce, which was the first thing that should have been done. And they told us how you save that money. They told us things that I'd never have dreamt of, like pre-packing saline drips. I say this out loud, I don't even know what this means. But they did, and that was the point. And it convinced me that if we respected and understood that contribution that people have to make and that deeply held desire in every community, in every part of Britain to make it, we could build a country that works again.
Thank you. Well, that was a really, really compelling lecture, and I thought during the question and answer session you threw out so many really, really gripping ideas, and I think the theme was really this was a kind of vision for renewal, which, dear God, we do need, I think, you know, people say sometimes that political parties go through periods when they have ideas and periods when they don't. It is beginning to sound as though your party is finding its knack for ideas again, and you're I think one of the main central and most important spokespeople for that, Lisa. So we're really, really grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Very much. And I also want to thank our sponsors tonight. Nicola Miller of the Institute of Advanced Studies here at University College. So the Orwell Foundation is housed in University College, and we're tremendously grateful to them for their hospitality in giving us space and supporting us as they have done now for several years, and we hope they will continue to do so. We have a very good and strong relationship with them. I'd also like to thank the UCL Policy Lab and Mark Steers. Where is Mark? Yeah, Mark. Hello, Mark. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for your support. The Policy Lab does really important and interesting work, and people should follow what it's doing because it's right up there at the forefront. So thank you for your support. Political Quarterly sponsors us frequently. We have a representative of the Political Quarterly on our board, and we're very grateful to them for their continuing support. And finally, but not least, Richard Blair, George Orwell's son, whose generosity to us over many, many years is very deeply, deeply appreciated by us. So thank you all for your support.